And welcome to Western Civ Historical Walking Tour. This is downtown Phoenix, ASU University campus, one of their off-puts out to the side. So we're standing right now at Heritage Square and Science Park. So the Museum of Science is there in the distance. This is the Rosten House. We're going to come back and take a look at that at the end and talk about Victorian architecture. What we're going to essentially do is do a quick loop around to First Street and then come back around to Heritage Square to see what we can see here. So obviously, Phoenix, relatively young city, doesn't have as much history as maybe a New York or a Boston, but there's still things that we can talk about. You know, the history of Phoenix goes back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, especially if you're going to count pre-Columbian civilization over here. There is evidence that the site that we're standing on right now was occupied all the way going back to somewhere between 700 and 1400 AD. Now, why here? Why Phoenix? Why does civilization exist here in the middle of the desert? Well, Phoenix is in the middle of the desert, that's true. However, it's a little bit less of the desert than in other parts of the Southwest. Why? Because one key reason: it's got water. It has more water than some of the other places that you might expect to see in the surrounding region. The main river and watershed that flows through here, and which is why settlers eventually began to settle here, is called the Salt River. Salt River feeds a number of different tributaries in the area. We're not going to be able to see it on this particular walking tour, but maybe in the future we'll go down and check it out. We know that the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the region did develop really specific and highly technical irrigation techniques to take advantage of that civilization and that river. Actually, if you stop here and we look in the distance, you can also see where the Arizona Diamondbacks play, the baseball stadium. Unfortunately, on the outside, it's not as much to look at. Now, the pre-Columbian inhabitants of the region vanished at some point after 1400. Whether or not that had anything to do necessarily with the first settlers that came in and some of the Spaniards, we're not sure. All we can say is that those original inhabitants were gone long before the first American settlers showed up. Phoenix's modern history really gets started in the year 1867. In the year 1867, Jack Swilling, one of the first settlers to the region, shows up and decides that this would be a good place to start a colony. And again, the reason that he decides that this would be a good place to start a colony is because of the access to water, which is more plentiful than in other areas. By 1868, they had already established a relatively small colony in the area. And then the first question became, okay, well, what are we going to call it? And this is one of those interesting stories about history, because it's going to take a little bit for Phoenix to arrive at the final name of Phoenix. First, it's going to go through, of course, Swilling's Mill, then Mill City, then East Phoenix gets started. And then in a really interesting twist, you see, Jack Swilling was actually an ex-Confederate soldier. This is 1867. And so he's an ex-Confederate soldier, and he wants to name the city that I'm currently standing in, Phoenix. He would prefer to name it Stonewall Jackson. So instead of Phoenix, Arizona as the capital of Arizona, you would have Stonewall Jackson, Arizona. I think at this point we can all be happy that Phoenix won out. Phoenix was finally officially recognized on the 4th of May, 1868 as an actual city. Just continue walking along here. Where we're standing right now is at the corner of the convention center. So I'm going to turn around here in a second so that you can take a look here. It's actually very beautiful. We'll see it on the flip side as well in just a second. The lots, as an aside, when they were originally sold in this downtown region, went for an average price of about $48. As you can expect, Phoenix real estate has gone up a little bit since that time. All right, we've reached First Street now, so we're gonna head down to Washington. It wasn't until 1874 that the city was officially recognized by the United States. That was the work of then President Grant. All right, here we are. So where I'm standing right now is at the intersection of First and Washington, and this would have been it. This would have been, in the 1860s and 1870s, the extent of Phoenix would have been this intersection and about 3 or 4 blocks in every direction. Now, obviously, a lot has changed since then, But if you were to come to Phoenix and stand right where I'm standing right now at First and Washington, there would have been just Jack Swilling's old mill and a couple of other storehouses. And that would have been it. Let's head back to the square. As you see the trolley go past, obviously the train and the coming of the train in the late 19th century was the biggest first game changer that took place. And then President Teddy Roosevelt authorized the construction of several key dams in the region, which allowed the residents to take advantage of some of the water, which also allowed the city to grow. Now, that being said, I mean, the city has grown tremendously. In the last 50 years, it's gone from, I believe, 96th in the United States of America in terms of size to 6th. In terms of square miles, it's one of the largest cities in the United States. Let's head down this way. Phoenix has not always been the capital of Arizona. It's been moved several times since 1864. First it was at Navajo Springs, then Prescott, then Tucson. Then they tried to move it to La Paz. That didn't work, so they moved it back to Tucson. Finally, before settling on Phoenix. Almost back now. You can see the ballpark in the distance. Just gonna have this sneak along the outside here. More or less on the back side of the convention center at this point. Here's another entrance here. We should be able to head back. What's to there? All right, so we've basically come full circle now. This is the back side of the Science Museum. We'll walk through here. Really pretty. Heritage Square, which is where a number of the museums, Children's Museum, Science Museum, are situated, is actually pretty small. If I were to just walk around that, it would only take me 2 or 3 minutes. But we're gonna go take a look at the Rosson House. The Rosson House is just, it's an excellent example of Victorian architecture. Now, Victorian architecture is kind of a unique architectural term compared to like modern architecture or Gothic or something like that, that has a set style. Victorian architecture is kind of a catch-all term. It just refers to different architectural styles that dominated while Queen Victoria was Queen of England, which was for an incredibly long period of time. It includes everything from early Gothic, folk Victorian, Greek Revival, Second Empire, Romanesque Revival, Shingle, Colonial Revival, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it originated in England, but very quickly spread to all different parts of the globe where the English had influence, all the way from Australia, New Zealand, and then of course the United States, where you see it mostly in a different colonial style. The Victorian period was a period of increasing wealth for just about everybody across the board. And so, for the first time, it wasn't just the upper echelons of society who could afford to build a house that they thought looked beautiful. And so they kind of went all out. So we're going to take a look at this house here. We'll walk around it, and then I'll show you some elements of Victorian architecture that are fairly consistent throughout. So this is the property that we're talking about here. Obviously, it was not one of the first homes constructed in the region. This particular property wasn't built until 1894. So some 30 years after the establishment of the city. So what can we say about different elements of Victorian architecture? Well, first of all, one thing that you're almost always going to note about a piece of Victorian architecture is the brickwork. Victorian architecture uses a lot of exposed brick, sometimes painted, sometimes not. This obviously is not painted. Another element that you'll notice are these wraparound porches. Wraparound porches are pretty consistent in Victorian architecture, so we tend to see a lot of those. We'll walk around to the front again so you can see that. Now, if you look up at the roof, what you're going to notice is that that's at probably about a 75-80 degree angle. Steeply pitched roofs are another element of Victorian architecture, as is that ironwork that you see at the top and some of the fancy gabling along the sides with the work. It's all about almost an ostentatious level of beauty. 2 to 3 stories is pretty typical for a piece of Victorian architecture. But I think the most clearly definable way to see something, at least in the United States, that's Victorian, is you're almost always going to get an octagonal, this one's octagonal, or a circle turret style, church style tower in the top. You can see it a little bit better if I back up here. So whenever you're walking in any sort of city and you see one tower that's either circular or octagonal like that with a steeply pitched roof, goes all the way up, it's almost always going to be a piece of Victorian architecture. The other thing that you're going to notice about buildings like this is that they're asymmetrical. So there's the tower on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side just has the steeply pitched roof. So it doesn't mirror on both sides. Those are things that you're going to notice. Well, follow the channel for more historical walking tours. Until next time, this has been Western Civ.